So we would like to start off by launching a couple of polls to find out who we have in our audience. So if you don't mind taking a few minutes to answer the polls that are being launched, we would appreciate it. And as you are completing those polls, then we will go ahead and get started with this evening's presentation and very exciting discussion. So it is my pleasure to introduce the keynote speaker for the evening, Mr. Paul Bracy. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of his background, because if I went into detail about all of the wonderful work he has done in this racial justice and equity and inclusion arena, then that would take the entire evening and you wouldn't get a chance to hear from him. So I'm just gonna briefly go over his bio. So Paul is a human relations educator and consultant. He has over 50 years of experience developing and delivering educational training programs to corporations, institutions, and governmental organizations, both nationally and internationally. During his 21-year career in the United States Air Force, Paul developed and led the military's race relations educational program of 12,000 military and civilian employees. Say, hold on a minute, something popped up and kind of lost my place. So give me a minute to find my place again. So Paul developed and led the military's race relations educational program for 12,000 military and civilian employees while assigned to Kadena Air Force Base in Okinawa, Japan during the 1970s. During his career in the military service, Paul was twice awarded the Air Force Commendation Medal for outstanding performance and leadership. Upon retiring in 1978 from military service, Paul continued his human relations career through working with a variety of diversity and inclusion consulting firms and his own firm, Collaborative Strategies Incorporated, until his second retirement in 2009. Paul was also a community outreach coordinator for the Adolescent Violence Prevention Project in Boston, working with community agencies and delivering violence prevention education across the communities of Boston. He opened the first in the nation office of adolescent violence prevention at the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. In 1989, Paul co-founded and was the first president of Concerned Black Men of Massachusetts. And before I turn it over to Paul, I just will remind all of our guests and participants to please remain muted. Post your questions in chat. And if you have a question for a specific panelist or for Paul, make sure you put their name next to your question in chat so we can be sure to guide that question to the appropriate person. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Mr. Paul Bracy.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for the kind introduction, and you and Dr. Winchell for your assistance and support. I'd also like to thank the interim dean of the College of Education and Health Sciences, Dr. Tom Wu, the executive director for the Martin Richards Institute for Social Justice, Jill Beckwith, and the president of the Massachusetts chapter of the Association of the National Association for Multicultural Education, Dr. Deborah Mamakin, for making this event happen. I'd also like to thank the university for its leadership in social justice. It's interesting. We did our first learning series here on campus at the university in the Adrian Tinsley Center in January 2020. So it's really gratifying to come back this evening and share with you our progress. Now, there are a couple of people I'd like to give, and organizations I'd like to give a shout out to. First would be my friends and colleagues on Martha's Vineyard who began with me when I had this idea of what to do, and they spent months with me really figuring out a direction for it. And as a result of that, they ended up forming the Martha's Vineyard Diversity Coalition. Another group I'd like to give a shout out to is the Bridgewater Communities for Civil Rights. There's 3 members, including me, are part of BCCR. And I want to thank them for their support, their attendance at the learning series, and the hours they spent with me talking about racism and white supremacy. I'd also like to thank Ruth Major, who painted that beautiful portrait of Doc. I'd also like to thank my wife, Sheila, and my family for their continued support and encouragement. And I'd like to thank everybody that's come this evening to hear our presentation, which we're really excited about to show you. You know, when we look around in our society and across the world, what we see is national discord. We see death, we see war, we see violence, we see trauma, we see the mass dislocation of people. And if we're talking nationally, probably the best example today is what's going on in Ukraine. The devastation, the toll that's being taken unnecessarily, talks of nuclear weapons, talk of chemical weapons, and the use of banned bombs that are being used. You know, we look at our own country, almost every issue that we face, there's a major division. We're talking about global warming, human rights, birth control, wearing of masks, gun control, voting rights, the attempted insurrection of January 6, 2021. We even have disagreement there. And we also have disagreement on teaching children a more truthful account of our history. And so, you know, you wonder, what's the problem? What's in the way? Why can't we? There's no talk of human reconciliation, and there's no honest attempt to bridge our divide. So before I talk more about the center and why the center, I'd like to give you a short history, both on our namesake and what motivated me to start this project. Doc Bracy was born in Georgia, June 11th, 1859, to an enslaved mother and a white enslaver who did not acknowledge him as his son. From that tragic beginning and the tyranny that surrounded him, Doc persevered. He educated himself. He eventually attended Atlanta Baptist Seminary, which would eventually become Morehouse College. He became a minister. He built churches. He renovated churches, or restored churches, some still in operation today. And he sent all his children to college. His perseverance, commitment, and courage is a model for our organization. My great-grandfather passed away in 1953 when I was 13. From before his birth till today, the residual of that institution of slavery are still with us, even though some people will want to deny that. I've been involved in, Dr. McGowan's already indicated, I've been involved in doing this work for quite a bit of time. And he mentioned my work on Okinawa. That was a life-changing event for me. I conducted programs for almost 5 years. It taught me a lot. When I retired from the service in 1978, I thought we were moving in a good place, that the society was going ahead. But as I was adapting to civilian life, I realized we hadn't made as much progress as I thought. So in 1990, I returned to the human relations education field as a diversity consultant, and Dr. McGowan's already mentioned this, but I did worked in companies all across the country and internationally. Again, a life-changing experience for me. And I retired in 2009, not because I thought the job was done, but I thought that others would take hold of it. But something happened. Something happened that was a turning point for me. Now, I've told you some, as you look at this picture here of my family, you can see I come from a very diverse, and I have a very diverse family. I've mentioned my background on Doc. You see my great aunt, Julia Stanfield, was an indigenous person. Okay. In my family today, there are African Americans, Okinawans, Ghanaians, Koreans, Jews, Christians, Muslims, whites. The incident that was the tipping point for me involved a grandson who was in kindergarten school. And a white classmate said to him, "I can't be your friend or play with you till your skin turns white." That hurt him to the point he didn't want to go back to school. It hurt and angered his parents. It hurt me as well, because two things happened. It caused me to think about my own experience around his age when race and racism was introduced to me in a very similar way. And I began to wonder, when I was thinking about what to do, because I knew I couldn't sit on the sideline anymore, that event was too much for me. But I also thought about, there's 160 years between when Doc was born and my two youngest biological children, my grandchild and my great-grandchild. And I wondered, what will the world be like for them? Will they stand proud of their heritage? Or would my grandson feel that he wished his skin was white? Or would my great-grandson be ashamed to acknowledge his mother because she wasn't white? At this point, I knew I had to do something, and I had to do something different, because the 50+ years I had been working on racism, along with other people, really couldn't tell if we had an impact, if we made a difference. And interesting, Doc had written a poem for young ministers. The title of the poem was, "Be a Good Leader and Tell the Whole Truth." I've never been a minister, but his words have guided me. And that was the turning point. That was the beginning of creating the Doc C. Bracy Institute for Human Reconciliation. What are our goals? What are we trying to achieve? Well, our name tells you one. We're interested in global human reconciliation. But you know the old saying, think globally, act locally. So what are we thinking about in the US? What is our vision for the US? Well, it's really enclosed in our vision for this country. It's a country where every child's human rights, no matter how they show up, are seen as paramount. They need to be protected, and that the society operates in a way from local to national to ensure the rights of every child. That's a big ask. That's a big vision. How do we accomplish such a vision? It's by adults coming together, bridging our divides, and really make a focus on the most important job that we have, is ensuring a future for our children. The other thing that's important here, because there's a lot of challenges, we focus on the eradication of racism, other forms of human oppression. How do we do that? Well, we provide free education, and I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about the learning series, and Randy will talk about the book club. We've created a committed anti-racist community, and we'll tell you what that's about. And we also have a problem-solving orientation, and we'll talk more about that. So that's what we do, how we do it, what is our approach? Well, we talked about, we outreach to adults. And that's the thing, we outreach to people who want to do something, okay? And we invite them to attend one of our free sessions. They could either go to the book club, which is a monthly requirement, and like I said, Randy will talk more about that, or our Eradicating Racism, a Path Forward learning series. And I'm going to talk a little bit more detail on this. I think I forgot to introduce my colleagues, but I'll get back to that, because the Eradicating Racism, we moved to Zoom. When we did that session in 2020, if it wasn't for Colony Manville, who was one of the people on the team, we never would have been able to move from a classroom to Zoom. And I always think she taught an old dog new tricks. And I want to introduce you to the other team members, Erika Bronstein, Sambaumgarten, Richard Woy, and our Chief Operating Officer, Rhonda Wilding. You'll be hearing from them shortly. But once we complete the learning series, that's typical, like a typical workshop. The workshop's over. However, if you want to stay involved with the organization, then there's a few things that go on. And Randy, bring up the other slide with this. So back up. So you've completed the learning series. The problem solving and that Finding Your Voice community are all in the Finding Your Voice program. So there's a couple of other steps that you need to go through to get there. One is that you agree with the shared vision, that you can support the shared vision. And you sign a personal pledge. The personal pledge involves 4 points. Next slide. And basically there's 4. Self-educate. You've already started that in the learning series, but that's a continual process of learning at a level that you can start to think of creative and different ways to approach eradicating racism and other forms of oppression in your community, in our society. The other part of that is being willing to share with others, to take your learning and share it with others. Second point, build empathy. This is a very challenging conversation full with a lot of emotional anxiety. So appreciate the fact that people are going to struggle for this. Do not context this issue as good and bad people, because that's not the case. People are going to struggle to get there. Third point, display courage. Speak up, speak your voice. Do it in a way that brings people closer to you. So that's the idea of compassion. The fourth is support policies and solutions that you feel will move your community and the country forward. If you do these things, next slide. Keep on. If you do those things, those 3 things, now you have an opportunity to participate in the Finding Your Voice community. When we talk about creating pathways here, what we feel is that as you begin to find your voice, to find your conversation in this, you will also figure out the pathways where you can be most effective towards getting to the vision. Communities are different, people are different. So it's not that we're going to go in the same direction versus we're going for the same thing. The Finding Your Voice program, the community that you're going to be introduced to, everybody in that community has signed a pledge so that everybody is there for the same reason. The other thing about once you join this community, the center is committed to help you actualize that pledge in your life and in your community. So we're going to be a support to you ongoing once you sign the pledge. We see ourselves as a learning organization, and we see the Finding Your Voice community as a learning opportunity. And what we mean by that, every time we learn and we apply that learning, the results of that application are opportunities to learn more about what we've done. So it's a constant, continuous learning process of making advances towards our goal, which is creating an environment where all children are valued. Excuse me. The other thing that we do with this is we evaluate every aspect of our program to ensure that we're current, that we're meeting the needs of the people that want to engage with us. Next slide. I'd like to kind of leave you with this. And it's kind of interesting to me as I've been thinking about this. I wonder if we collectively, as people who care, have the courage, the commitment, and the perseverance to make the words that we expect our children to say when they pledge allegiance. Can we make those real in our society? One nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Can we do that? Can we be the change that we want to see in the world? Are we going to continue to allow our children to pledge to something that's not true? I think that's a question for all of us. What will we do with that? And I'd like to pass it on now to Erika, who's going to talk more about the learning series and her own experiences in developing this program. Thank you.
Hi, I'd like to thank BSU for hosting this event and for all of you for being here. My name is Erika Bronstein, and I thought I would start by telling you a little bit about myself and my path to being here tonight. In many ways, anti-racism has been an organizing principle of my life. I worked for many years with Paul as a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant. And before that, I was involved in efforts to bring racial and gender equity into the labor movement. And more recently, I've been working with the Center for Restorative Justice at Suffolk University to bring a racial justice focus into our restorative justice work. And on a more personal level, my daughter's adopted from China, and I'm very deeply committed to my interracial family. But to be honest, being white, comfortable, semi-retired, and having experienced some personal loss recently, my level of personal engagement with racial justice had not been really front and center for the last few years. The murder of George Floyd and many others, and the momentum for change spurred by the Black Lives Movement, made me take a hard look at how much or how little I was really doing, and led me to reach out to Paul to support his efforts to build the Bracy Center. I've been involved in designing the learning series since its beginning, which was right here at BSU, and it's made me realize how little many of us, especially white people, know about the systems, structures, and dynamics of white supremacy. There were so many aha moments for participants. Our own history has been deliberately hidden from us. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what we do in the series. As Paul said, there are 4 sessions. In the first session, we explain that racism is more than just personal bias or prejudice. We all have prejudices. But to be racist is more than that. It means supporting, actively or passively, the ideas and policies that normalize racial inequities. These policies include everything from the war on drugs to housing policy to school curriculum. And then in the second session, we move to looking at some of the ways that over many years, government policy and other institutions have created systems of racial advantage. These advantages and disadvantages are still alive and well today, and those of us who are white have benefited, even if we didn't ask for the benefits, even if we are outraged by them. That doesn't mean that all whites are economically privileged or live on easy street or haven't suffered, but we haven't suffered because of our race. In session 3, we start to unpack white supremacist ideology a bit more. And for me, it's really like smog. It's in the air we breathe. It soaks into our consciousness. It affects how we see ourselves and others. The targets and perpetrators of racism, of course, are affected in different ways, but we're all harmed, and our humanity is diminished by racism. And then finally, the 4th session, we begin to think about how can we start talking to other people about this, about racism. We asked people to talk with someone they knew about what they had learned from the learning series, and then to reflect on how it went and how they felt and what they learned from that conversation. Conversations about race are so emotionally loaded and fraught, and we're trying to encourage all of us to kind of lean into the discomfort of those conversations rather than to avoid them. So we have found that with practice and self-reflection, we can increase our effectiveness in challenging racism, even if we may never be totally comfortable. So I know this series helped me. I found I was engaging in more conversations with my family members about race, and there's still a lot more that I want to do. But it really has made a difference for me, and I think for many others as well. So at this point, I'd like to pass it along to Sambaumgarten from BCCR.
Good evening, everyone. I'm very glad to be here participating in this event with my Doc Bracy and DICE colleagues and BCCR friends and so on. As a representative of Bridgewater Communities for Civil Rights, I begin my portion of tonight's webinar with this quote taken from the Boston Globe, letter to the editor, written in 1968 and published recently in the Globe's 150th anniversary issue. To passively oppose racism is to collaborate with it. In a way, these words summarize the approach taken by me and other members of BCCR who are not at all passive, but rather use our voices and take action to eradicate racism. BCCR's anti-racist activism began back in 2015. Some individuals in the town of Bridgewater witnessed 2 incidents of hate speech, one in our local post office and one in a supermarket. Concerned about these incidents, these citizens came together to discuss ways to support the victims of harmful treatment and to find ways to promote and model acceptance and inclusion. As a product of these discussions, a group called Bridgewater Citizens for Civility and Respect was formed. 2 years ago, we changed our name to Bridgewater Communities for Civil Rights. And BCCR's work is guided by our mission statement. We are a community-based organization dedicated to defending the rights of all persons while fostering open communication, providing opportunities to examine issues of social justice, and advocating for the elimination of bias and racism. Making this mission come alive has included engaging in standouts, presenting forums on controversial topics, offering bystander training, collaborating with other activist groups, prodding our local officials to stay focused on inclusion, equity, and diversity, and also creating and circulating an anti-racism pledge. After meeting and getting to know Paul about 3 years ago, I and other members of BCCR participated in the initial Friends for Life series, as noted, which took place at BSU. These readings, films, and follow-up discussions, which have been described by Erika, really came to give us a much deeper and fuller understanding of the depth and breadth of racism. And we learned more about the truth of America's racist history. Our eyes have been fully opened to the types of bias and discrimination that people of color, and here I include Indigenous people, Asian Americans, and so on, that those people have faced and continue to face on a daily basis. My personal commitment has continued through participation in the Doc Bracy Center's Finding Your Voice program, which helps us to find new and better ways to speak out in the effort to eradicate racism. It's a daily challenge, I think, to find the best ways to speak to people that we would like to engage in these discussions and do it in a comfortable, friendly way. In sum, my BCCR colleagues and I can do nothing less than stay committed to the mission statement. We cannot just passively oppose racism, as noted in the opening quote, but must work actively for its eradication. And now I will turn it over to Richard Woy, who has been involved with the research end of the Doc Bracy Center and doing some of our statistical work. Richard.
Hello and good evening. I appreciate the chance to be part of this panel today. As was mentioned, my role is to say a few words about our efforts to evaluate the effectiveness of the Bracy Center. And that's been my role in it so far. As Paul indicated in his comments, our overall approach for the center includes an ongoing effort to evaluate its activities. It has 2 components. The first is just tracking key indicators of center activities and things like member participation. The second is periodic special studies. To date, the primary special study we've done involved a follow-up session held in March of last year 1 month after completion of one of the education series that Erika described, an earlier version of the current one. A central purpose of the follow-up session was to assemble and document the various thoughts, ideas, activities, plans, and other experiences regarding racism generated by the participants during the month after completion of the course, based on participants' responses to a set of questions, and as indicated in the slide here. There were two notable findings. First is that in the month after completing the course, it was clear that participants had thought a lot about racism, had carried out an impressive array of activities to counter racism, and had formulated and in some cases initiated various plans for the future. There really isn't time now to recount all the thoughts and activities and plans reported, but we were quite impressed with how extensive they were. The second notable finding, and equally important from our perspective, is that participants directly attributed some of what they were thinking, doing, and planning regarding racism to things they had learned and or experienced during the course itself. These findings, we think, provide preliminary qualitative evidence that the education series is contributing to achievement of its goals and the goals of the center. For anyone who's interested, a copy of the full technical report of the study is available through the Doxey Bracy Center. I should also mention we're working on plans for additional studies of other aspects of the center. Now, as you know, we've been asked to provide our own responses to a couple of questions. The first is, how has my understanding of racism deepened? In my case, it's been primarily through my work, through my career as a clinical psychologist and researcher at the National Institute of Mental Health and elsewhere, and as consultant. I've been aware of the stressors and healthcare disparities associated with race for many years and involved in various efforts to address them. However, while that work involved race and racism as part of my other issues, my participation in the development of the learning series and the Bracy Center has involved addressing the issue directly, which I really, frankly, hadn't done before. And in turn, I think sharpening my awareness of racism as a really central and structural issue in America. And I'm hoping it's helped me to develop a stronger framework for understanding and expression. As for how I'm using my voice, for many years, my primary role has been to collect and analyze data, assess needs, and evaluate effectiveness of programs. That is the role I've been playing with the Doxey Bracy Center. And so in a sense, I think that probably is the primary way at present that I'm trying to use my voice to combat racism. Thanks again for the opportunity to be part of this panel, and I will turn over the presentation now to our next panelist, Randy.
Good evening, everyone. Richard, thank you so much. My name is Rhonda Wilding. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the Doxey Bracy Center, and I'm very honored to be that for the center. I live in Howard County, Maryland, so a little far away from Bridgewater. Howard County is a suburb of Baltimore, Maryland. I am a husband of 21 years. I am the papa, very proud papa, of two beautiful adopted African-American children.
And after the murder of George Floyd, which Erika mentioned, I began my own community organization. And what I found was that I could make a bigger contribution if I joined with the Bracy Center and have a greater role in that. How has my understanding of racism deepened? As Erika mentioned, smog. I'm now seeing the racism and white supremacy in the air. As Bridgewater's own Beverly Daniel Tatum, Dr. Tatum, in her book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, and Other Conversations About Race, also explains the cycle of racism is like a moving walkway. Active racist behavior is equivalent to walking fast. Passive racist behavior is equivalent to standing still on the moving walkway, and bystanders are just being moved along with the active racists. Unless they realize and are walking in the opposite direction, actively anti-racist, they will be carried along with the others. So, are you active, passive, or are you trying to break the walkway? We're trying to disrupt it. Once you can see the smog, you can't unsee it. And once you're aware that you're riding the moving walkway, you can't unknow it. The center's approach is through education, kindness, and building a community for continuous learning and improvement. Another question posed to the panelists: how am I using my voice? I'm using my voice by volunteering professional experience, time, and passion to grow the center, and using my privilege wherever possible to engage other white people in this effort. I'm going to tell you about our monthly book discussions, our Finding Your Voice program, and how you can help. So, as Paul mentioned, our Reading for Understanding monthly virtual book discussions are outreach, free educational events. They are open to everyone. Since July 2020, we've read and discussed 20 books, with the next, that's April, the next discussion is 400 Souls, A Community History of African America, 1619 to 2019, by Drs. Ibram X. Kendi and Keisha N. Blaine. We are centering Black, Indigenous, people of color, BIPOC authors, and encouraging everyone to purchase from Black-owned bookstores. With the requirement of being virtual, we've had a global participation for both the Eradicating Racism learning series and the book discussions. And this geographic and cultural diversity has enriched our discourse. In addition to the live event where participants have the opportunity to discuss the book in small groups, the center publishes the book discussion materials used. These resources are made available on our website with the hope that others will conduct their own events. So we are giving people the tools to conduct a similar event. So if they'd like to use our materials, they're welcome to do that. As Paul mentioned, the Finding Your Voice program is a growing community of anti-racists. Again, the Finding Your Voice program is a growing community of anti-racists, and I'm very proud to say that a lot of them are on this call tonight. Thank you for joining. We've signed, everyone within the program has signed the center's anti-racism Human Reconciliation Pledge, making a commitment to ourselves and establishing an ongoing relationship with the center. What does it mean to be part of the Finding Your Voice community? We have built an online forum to meet, exchange ideas, resources, and to discuss topics that are critical to this work. Participants have the opportunity to interact with each other asynchronously and collaborate on issues that are most relevant to them. We are committed to continuous learning and improvement and are using the feedback collected from the community to inform the topics for our live monthly events. For example, how can I engage other white people in eradicating racism? Interpersonal communication. Why has the 1619 project been removed from our library? Systemic racism. Every meeting is unique, and every meeting offers a safe and engaged space for growth. There is no cost to participate in the Finding Your Voice community, but the value in knowing you are not alone in the anti-racism journey is priceless. So, you may be asking yourself, and I hope you are, how can you help? Please share our message and goal with your friends, family, and organizations. Register for our 4-part learning series and other events, and the other events being the Reading for Understanding, monthly book discussions. Join our growing anti-racist community. Intern with the center. And lastly, donate to the center. We are a registered nonprofit, so your contributions are tax deductible. And with that, I would like to thank you all so much for having us tonight. And I would like to turn the microphone and presentation over to Dr. Winchell and Dr. McGowan.
Thank you so much, Randy. And thank you to all the panelists and speakers tonight. It has just been delightful to hear about the work. We have actually quite a number of questions for you, some of which you didn't see in chat because they were privately asked. So what we'll do is we'll throw the question out, and Paul, or if others want to respond, we have one question that was specific to a person, but the rest seem to be general questions. You may have seen the question in the chat from Christina asking, what kinds of activities do your participants report doing to combat racism in their lives? Kind of a related question to that I received as well was, what can each of us do to eradicate racism in our schools and communities? So I think we want to hear what we need to be doing. So Paul, do you want to start? Thank you.
Well, I was going to ask Dick, I don't know if we have that information available. Dick, do you remember what some of the people were saying about what they were doing?
Absolutely. Although, Paul, do you want to go ahead and say a few things?
I'm sorry.
Yes. Do you want to say anything beforehand?
No, go ahead and relate what people said they were doing.
Okay. One of the questions in this follow-up session was, what have you been doing in the past month to combat racism? There were a whole bunch of responses. They fell into several categories. Some were reading books and taking courses. There were a number of books mentioned. A second area was participation in advocacy organizations and efforts to influence change, and organizations like BCCR and DICE figured in those comments, a lot of people mentioned efforts at organizational change, mostly through the workplace. There was mention of establishment of diversity committees and of hiring efforts to hire people to focus on these issues. As I say, most of them were in the workplace. Others mention political and community advocacy activities. For example, running for city council. There were others who mentioned meeting, say, with the police chief to talk with him or her about policing issues and race. And finally, a number of people mentioned things they were doing with family and friends, talking with their children or grandchildren about these issues, picking up a friend that they know has conservative views and trying to engage them in difficult discussions. Those were some of the things. There were others who were involved in trying to establish new programs and projects and develop new skills, advocacy and community organizing skills. As I say, there were a whole bunch of things that people were involved in and thinking about. Those interested in this, I would urge them to read the report, the full report that describes a lot of these in more detail.
Yeah, I would agree with you. There was a lot of responses to that. And I'd like to try the second question about how to get training into schools or something. That's not an easy sell. You can see what's happening in the environment now. So I don't know, there's not a straightforward answer. It's really having a conversation with people that really don't understand what you're trying to accomplish out of the limelight, not in front of TV cameras, not in a public setting, as what we've seen recently when people are trying to talk about, they've got CRT confused with educating children and all. And it's like, we don't really want to have a conversation. So schools are in a really tough situation, particularly teachers who want to teach something. Where is it in Florida? They just passed legislation not to talk about LGBTQ, and burning books and all. You see, we've got a real problem, but we're not trying to bitch it. We're trying to do it through TV and these quick little buzzwords and stuff, instead of looking at what kind of environment are we trying to create for our children. And that's why I mentioned the flag. That's not a true story. Why do we allow children to say that without a preference? And it's like, are we going to be able to do that? I think schools are under pressure, but parents are also under pressure. And you look at the division here. I am worried. I'm really worried about our country. There's too many contradictions in this society. Too many. If we want to create an environment for children, you can't have homelessness. Have we really focused on a plan to eliminate homelessness? Childhood hunger? There's a real question about whether society cares.
Sam, I think you wanted to add here as well.
Yeah, I wanted to take an opportunity to expand a little bit on what I and other colleagues in the BCCR, Bridgewater Communities for Civil Rights, has been involved in. And I think it really involves a deep commitment to being active. And interestingly, we have had many standouts on the Bridgewater Common on the streets with our anti-racism signs. We were out there for Ukraine recently. We've been out there for just about anything that happens in society that seems to be unfair to a group of people. And Cleone, who's not on the call tonight, representing DICE, she came to us for support when she had an issue with the schools because she saw us out there. And Paul came to BCCR because he saw a table of ours set up in front of the supermarket. So I think, number one, when you put yourself out there, people start to gravitate to you and you build a community that way. So my first suggestion would be, if you're not standing out on the street corner, get out on the street corner and show what you believe and what you care about. Another thing that's been very important for us is the prodding of our local officials. Our local town council, again, under the gun of us constantly asking them, about a year and a half ago, formed an ad hoc committee to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. That committee has completed its work and I believe has made a report on how to ultimately create a permanent committee within the council structure to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. Similarly, the school district has formed a committee, community participants for DEI, and I and others on this call are participating in that. They also hired a director for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And all of those things did not happen just out of thin air. They happened because local citizens like us are asking, when are you going to do this? What are you doing about these issues? And we, for example, have last June, we asked the town council to approve a resolution to fly the pride flag in Bridgewater, which they approved and did for the first week of June. They also declared Juneteenth a local holiday in Bridgewater, and we're hoping to fly the Juneteenth flag this year. So, I mean, all of those little things keep these issues out in the public eye, but it takes the effort to get out there, to speak up, to prod, to not go away and keep the questions coming. And we have an issue coming up now because we're trying to do Juneteenth celebration again. And we need to ask our town council for support for using some certain properties in town so we can do this, but we're not going to step back and just disappear. We're going to keep the prodding going. So that's sort of my message, is to be active. And of course you can run for office too. And if Cleone was here, she would tell you she's running for school committee in our local district after a couple of years of battling with administration. So we're hoping she gets elected in April. Thank you.
Randy, I think, wanted to respond to this question too, Kevin, before we go on to the next. Okay, go ahead, Randy.
Thank you. And for those of you that are not in the Bridgewater area or familiar with the word standout, as a Marylander, I had to learn what it was. I didn't know. It's a common area in the city, usually close to the town hall, that they stand out and they hold signs and say exactly what you should be doing and expressing opinions. And it's fantastic. So it was a new term for me. Thank you, Sam. What I've realized is that people who would like to take action sometimes need to do research first. And that can also be daunting because sometimes you have to, unless you know already, you need to figure out what's going on in your local area. It's fairly easy to figure out what's going on nationally, but when it comes to your school board, when it comes to your city council, your state elected officials, that's when it takes a little bit more investigation. So I would suggest, if you're outside of the Bridgewater area or even inside, that you look at the local chapter of the NAACP, the ACLU, standing up for racial justice. As you can tell, we're not saying just come to the Bracy Center. We want you there, but we also know that we can't do everything. And there are organizations that are doing fantastic work, but it may just take a little investigation. The other thing I would recommend is to find and identify, I used the term BIPOC previously, find Black, Indigenous, people of color on social media, if you are on social media, and follow them. because they are going to tell you exactly what's happening in their area and also concerns that are happening nationally and globally. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy and Paul and Sam, and also Richard for your responses to that question. And Paul, that sort of leads into this next question, and any other of the panelists who would like to answer it as well. But Paul, you mentioned that you have been working in this arena of anti-racism for more than half a century, and at times couldn't tell whether your work was making a big difference. So many of us get discouraged by what we see. Progress seems to be slow and sporadic or insufficient. So how have you been able to keep up this work around anti-racism when the wins seem so small? So how have you been able to keep going with this work?
Yeah. It's interesting to ask that question, because what had happened when I was working around the country, people would ask me in seminars, well, what can I do? And I would tell them, learn more and act on it. And I thought, what's the chances of them doing that without support? So how have I been able to stay involved is when I started thinking about this next time, as a result of my grandson, have to do something different. And if you notice, we're focused on people and communities. I made a conscious decision. I don't want people to have to pay, if we can possibly do that, so that they would take advantage of the learning. If, and you look at our society and you say, well, why are you even going to try? What choice do we have? That's the thing. That's what got me back involved, but I got to do it differently. And as you heard some of the people on the team talk, there's a realization and understanding that this is a difficulty for people. And what we got to do is help people understand and build their confidence that they can do this. And so that's what got me back involved. I said, what excuse do I have? If I see what's happening to my family and I don't do anything, and I've been given an opportunity, those 50 years was an opportunity for me to really think through this issue and listen to people. I said, what am I supposed to do with all that understanding? So I'm back here to do it again. And hopefully we can get some people to join us, because, I don't expect to be around that much longer. I'm doing pretty good right now, but we got to get some younger folks in this that are really motivated, like Randy. Randy has been a godsend. We need younger people. And I'm not going to dye my hair so I look younger either. We need younger people. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Paul. Erika, I know you wanted to add as well, so we'll turn it to you.
Thank you. Just reflecting on both of those questions, I think for me, how to keep going. I mean, sometimes it's hard to find hope, and it can be very discouraging to look around and see all the things that are happening. I know that for me, being with other people who are committed to the same values and the same work makes an enormous difference. And I think on a very personal level, for me, being involved with Paul and other people at the Bracy Center has just been an enormous support and encouragement to me to continue doing the work. And it just, frankly, it just gives me hope. And I'm, anywhere these days where I can find hope, I've become very greedy about, seeking it out. And then the other thing is, in terms of work, I noticed there was a question, and some people were talking about how to bring this work into schools. And I'm doing a lot of work with schools right now, working with teachers and with administrators. And I'm working a lot around bringing circles and restorative justice into school. And we're also talking about how to use those practices to support racial equity and racial justice. And it kind of goes along with the support question, but my advice is really to start doing this work with other adults first, to find other teachers or other adults in the community to start having these questions about racial justice and one's own history, and to kind of deepen your own understanding and to expand your comfort level with these issues, because something is always going to happen in a classroom. I mean, that was, I know, was Cleone's experience with the schools too, Paul's experience. I mean, every day we're reading about things being posted in schools, swastikas and racist messaging and, you know, harassment. And I think it's really important for adults in those communities to come together and start talking themselves about these things and develop their own kind of capacity and deepen their understanding of a way to start bringing it to young people. I mean, obviously something has to be done in the moment, so we can't wait until we have all the answers to intervene in situations which are just so egregious and where people are getting hurt. But I think coming together to have these discussions, whether it's through the Bracy Center Learning Series or other groups you can pull together, is a really important first step. And children will follow adults. And if the adults in the community are standing up in ways that are anti-racist, the kids will learn from that. And the adults will be in a better position to spread the message among the kids. So that was just some thoughts I wanted to toss in.
I want to pick up on this because I want to make sure that people understand the Finding Your Voice program is not like a membership. You're not joining an organization. What you're doing is making the Bracy Center a resource for you to do your work in your community. So if you belong to another organization, you don't have to, you're not joining us. I don't know how to place it, you're hiring us. Once you sign the pledge, you've hired us to work with you. And as long as the organization is alive and well, we will support you. That's the intent, and to create an environment where the people in that program support one another. And that's what Randy was talking about, where we have internal circuits where people can communicate and strategize. Recognize we've just put this on the table, the Finding Your Voice program. So we're still in the process of building that. Yeah.
Thank you, Paul. I think that's really helpful because I know there were some questions in the chat about, you know, are there steps to joining your organization or, you know, so I think that's really helpful because I think as we've heard throughout the presentation, you're offering such a menu and array of ways to be involved. And so I really encourage, I know we've been posting throughout the time for people to visit your website, because I know as a professor at BSU, a lot of my students ask, how can I learn? Where do I start? Where do I go? There's so many resources out there, but where do I start? Where do I find something I can attend or join? And so I think your website is such a great place to start. Just, you know, joining a book discussion even is such a great place to start. So thank you for that clarification. What about for people who maybe feel like they can't get involved in your center's programs for one reason or another, right? The schedule doesn't work, whatever it is. Are there resources that any of you from the center would recommend in terms of things that folks should read or watch or listen to as they seek to further their own learning about anti-racist education?
Rather than me, as I'll look around. Randy, what do you think?
Well, I already mentioned one of them. It was actually the first book that we discussed in July of 2020, which was Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together at the Cafeteria by Dr. Tatum. And really anything written by Dr. Kendi, Ibram X. Kendi. We have a long list of books that we are looking at to read for next year. We have this year already planned out. You can very easily go to our website and look at the Reading for Understanding selection. That is a portion of them. The other one I would, if you are looking more into history, obviously the 1619 Project, as well as stamped from the beginning, the full version.
Yeah, I was surprised about how many things are on YouTube that you can go and get a lot of information. I think the difference with what we're trying to do is to have people in conversation, not in isolation, but in conversation, talk about that experience, get in touch with the emotional reactions to some stuff so you can get through that. I use the example that this conversation is like being on a plane, and you can see these dark clouds coming, and the pilot comes on and says, tighten your seatbelts, this is gonna be one hell of a ride, you know, and you start getting anxious, oh God, we're gonna get through this, and you go into the dark, and you might hit an air pocket, and you figure, I'm not gonna make it through this. Then all of a sudden, the plane starts to level out, you see the sun out there and the blue sky and all, and you got through it. And you can look back and see the clouds. It's the same way dealing with this issue. You can't go around that trauma and anxiety. You need to work yourself through it. None of us created this problem. None of us did that. But we do have a responsibility. Once we understand, we have a responsibility to our children, to our family, and to ourselves to fix it. And we can do that. Well, you know, I come from a family of preachers, so bear with me here. We can do this. People just need to not be fearful. The whole reason for the community is so you don't feel in isolation, that there are other people that think the way you do. I think we've got people like one person in Ohio or one person over here, but they have a community that they come with. And that is what's missing in this country. We don't have a plan. There is no plan to eliminate any kind of oppression in our society, but one. There's actually Bracy Center right now. Hopefully there'll be more. But that was one thing I realized. We don't have a plan in this country. And why is that? Yeah.
Thanks, Paul. I think Erika also wanted to add a little bit on the resources.
Thanks, Melissa. I firmly believe that eradicating racism is in everybody's interest, white people as well as people of color. And that, you know, certainly on a moral, spiritual level, in terms of our own humanity, we cannot be fully human as long as we have internalized any racism on that level. But there's a book that talks about it, The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee, which talks about it on a very kind of practical level by looking at all the ways that white people have been hurt by racism. And her central metaphor is she looks at the public swimming pools that were built in the South. And then when the laws were passed requiring desegregation of public facilities, many of these communities, rather than integrating the pools, closed the pools. And not only did they close them, they filled them up with dirt and concrete. They bulldozed them, and these communities don't have a pool anymore. And I think it's such a wonderful analogy for all the ways in which by not wanting to allow those people to have certain things, none of us have those things. And you can look at, you know, whether it's universal health care or certain social benefits that, or even the election of certain presidents, and I won't go further with that. But, you know, I think that on a very concrete level, on an economic and political level, white people are hurt by racism, as well as on a you know, more human level. So I think that's a great book for really understanding that and being able to approach people with that it's not only a good thing to do for others, but it's a really good thing to do for yourself when you're talking to white people.
So Paul and Erika, really thank you for those insightful comments. And it makes me think what you all have said here is this is ongoing work, and there's not going to be one workshop that you're going to attend that is going to address it. There's not going to be just one thing we pull off the shelf to address this. And I also wanted to highlight that the books that you all are recommending, it's not just to sit down and have a conversation, but there are action steps connected to these book readings. I know Randy mentioned Kendi's work and Dr. Tatum's work, and those readings lead with action steps, but there's not a one-time fix. You have to keep at it and keep working at it.
We did just get a new question in chat, and if you have other questions, please post them in chat. We're trying to leave airtime for our speakers. So if you have a question, open chat and put it there. But we just got another one, which is such a good question about how arts, music, painting, sculpture, dance, poetry, specifically mentioned there, how can we integrate the arts into anti-racist work? Randy, thanks. We'd love to hear from you.
So I was in a very interesting dialogue with other anti-racists who were taking, also from Massachusetts and New Hampshire, White People Challenging Racism, which is a series that Debbie Irving recommends in her book. The question or the idea came up of doing collaborative art as a way of bridge building. And that, for example, you could work on a poem, you could work on a story, you could co-author a piece of art, you could co-create. All of these, most of these things are possible even during, if we have to continue or need to do online work, online creation and collaboration, that art can still be produced. So bridging communities through art, through dance is the same way. That connecting, making those connections, and then coming up with a plan to be able, in a space, whether it's digital or in person, to be able to make that happen. Because as every artist knows, and every teacher knows, that learning together and creating together just reinforces the message and the goal.
You know, that question that you asked, Melissa, that Randy responded to, that's also a question that could come up to the Finding Your Voice community. A question like, what are you doing in your community? Or how could we do this? How could we work across communities? That's the value of the Finding Your Voice community. There's not a structure that says we do this and do this. This is for people to do their work and come up with their solutions and implement them. We're just creating a container with resources, expanding resources for people to do their work. And I think that's different. It's a different approach. And I think some people are they're looking for a leader. Well, you give me what's next. We'll say, no, that's not our job. You need to tell us so we can figure out how we can get what you need to you to do your work. So it's a gift, if you will. This container is a gift to people who want to do the work. What we want to be sure is they have a sense of how we think and approach the issue. That's what the learning series is about. And we are talking about bringing other people in different ways that have done a certain level of work that would qualify them not to have to go through the learning series. We haven't quite figured out how we're going to do that, but that's working with other organizations. You know, and we'd love students from BSU to be involved with us. That's just an aside. We would love to have that. We'd love to hear what young people think and what young people are doing. And educate us. Like this one person helped me figure out how to use Zoom. Randy's teaching me how to use Google and all that stuff. We need young people. How are we going to hook up all these people? They know how to do this. My grandkids got to go to school, so I can't use them.
Thank you, Paul and Randy. Both of your comments made me think too, as I know we've got some teachers to be on Zoom here tonight. I'm hoping that some of you have heard of photo voice, which is a research methodology, but I'm not recommending that you use it as a research methodology, although you may if you want to, be a nerd like some of us in the room are, including myself. But just the opportunity, as you were kind of describing, right, to collaborate and to create a container, a great word, Paul, and I love that your organization is about that. Randy, as you were talking about bridging communities, photo voice is basically allowing your students to take photos of their worlds and bringing them in and writing essays, and then finding, Randy, you had said, finding a way to share that work, right? So when I did it with a group of my refugee students, when I was an urban school teacher, we were able to do, to actually use an art gallery in the downtown of the city of Lynn to display the students' photos with their essays about their lives. And it was just such a powerful, impactful, cool community event. I learned the most, I think. So just, I think, finding those kinds of creative ways, whether you're in the classroom or not, but just want to put a shout out there to those of us who are in the classroom that, and thanks for the question, Z, in the chat. We shouldn't forget the arts. The arts just have such a way of bringing people together. So appreciate that. Sam, go ahead.
I can never give up an opportunity to talk about dance, because dance is what I do. I've been teaching dance for 30 or 40 years, and I still teach a community group in Bridgewater. And I think, dance is where children can come together and hold hands.
Yeah.
And it should be going on in classrooms. It should be going on in physical education. And those of you who are educators in the audience or who have children in schools, you should be asking questions about why your children aren't dancing if they aren't. Because again, it's non-competitive, it's cooperative, and it creates community. So that's my push for dance. Thank you.
Kevin, I'm not seeing any other questions. Are you?
So nope, Melissa, I just saw one about evening classes, and Randy provided the answer to that. So they will be having some evening sessions for folks who are working during the daytime.
Oh, excellent. I'm so sorry. I missed that one. Thank you. Yeah. And thank you, Randy. Excellent.
But one thing I also wanted to mention, because sometimes we had this come up in the sessions about intersectionality, that way in our learning series, we're very much focused on racism. But when we move into the Finding Your Voice community, that's where everything comes to the table. There's no way we can work on eradicating racism and not deal with other forms of oppression. What we're trying to do in the learning series is get people to really focus on an uncomfortable discussion around race. We move into the learning session, then we bring it all, because none of us show up in one dimension. There's a lot of stuff that goes into that. So I want people to understand, we do understand that we cannot deal with, you cannot eliminate one and not deal with the other. So I hope people understand, but we do that in the Finding Your Voice program.
And Paul, and what you just said really speaks to Kendi's work, because he is advocating for that too, that you can't do one without doing all of the intersectional identities.
Yeah.
Sam, I see your hand.
Sam, I think Sam had a comment.
Yeah, I just had two comments to add. One is that in addition to book series, which has been very successful for Randy, in Bridgewater, we've had a Black Lives Matter film series, which is now 2 years or more. One of our leaders is on the call. 3 years. Thank you, Betty. So we've had a film a month dealing with these issues and a discussion following the film. So if there are folks that you know who may not want to read books as much, but would prefer to watch a movie, that's another way to do it. And that just brings up a personal perspective that I thought I would share about how this work can be overwhelming at times. And once you get involved in these kinds of groups and you open up your email every day, there's another email from someone about a question, or, well, you should be reading this book, or have you looked at this TV program, or, and you feel like, well, I don't have time to do all of this. And I actually remember expressing this to Paul one time when we were sitting around coffee about how the fatigue builds up after a while of constantly paying attention to this. But then I realized that I have white privilege. I can be fatigued and it doesn't affect me. But if you're a person of color, you live with that all the time. And that thought sort of re-energizes me all the time, that I can't allow myself to be fatigued and drop out. I have to keep on this kind of work.
Thank you, Sam. Randy.
Yeah, Sam, thank you for sharing that. I'm not going to talk about exhaustion. Although I get exhausted, what I will say is that the Finding Your Voice program, the monthly meetings specifically, have been rejuvenating and have filled the bucket, the spiritual bucket. And it's very encouraging to talk to people who are in totally different regions, in different spaces. We, just in my small group, when we met last, it was last week, we met, and we had people from Nebraska, Ohio, Virginia. The common bond, the commonality, is being able to have and maintain a safe space for personal growth. And to be able to walk into a room and know that the person who you're talking to, you may never have met before, but you know that you're in company that is not judgmental, that you are going to talk about something and you're going to get an honest reaction, and kind of drop the pretense that a lot of people carry every day. So in that, I would just encourage everyone, if they can and can make time for the learning series. It's a critical part, as a prerequisite to becoming part of the Finding Your Voice program, but knowing that there is a community. It is personally reassuring to me that knowing every month, and this is from an organizer perspective, but when I enter that space, I'm not the organizer. I'm an active anti-racist, just like everyone else in the room. So that's what I wanted to say about the Finding Your Voice program. And thank you, Sam, for sharing that.
You may get a sense that we're passionate.
Paul, I think we're about ready to close. So I want to just turn it over to you for a moment to ask if you have any closing words for all of us. And you're on mute, Paul. There you go.
Yeah. If you understand the issue of this society about oppression, and there's so many different ways you can look at it. We got child trafficking, domestic violence, all of these things. We can do something about it once we make a commitment. It's not going to happen tomorrow. But if we don't put something in place today, we'll be talking about we can do something tomorrow. That's the whole intent behind the Doxy Bracy Center, to put something in place for people to do their work. There's a question, and we do it at the first learning series, that I would ask people to ask themselves: are you part of the solution or part of the problem? Do you do things in your life that you know are part of the solution? Or are you sitting on the sideline waiting for somebody else to do it? That would say you're part of the problem. I mean, there's a real question for us. about, are there enough people? Are there enough people that want things different and are willing to make that commitment to make it different? So that's part of why the pledge. Well, we hit a tipping point one day, but we know we're really turning the corner. If you love this country, it's the only country you got, we need to fix it. And we can do that. And I would suggest to you, the longer we don't, the more entrapped white people are going to be in white supremacy and not know how to get out of it. And as long as that's the case, we can't solve this problem. So I think what Erika was saying about learn how are white people hurt by this. That child that thought that people should turn white at some point, where did he get that from? What was that motivation? And how long will he carry that message? And how many children carry that and don't say anything? If you just kind of let things go as they're going, children are going to grow a certain way and have certain beliefs. Not understanding why some people are able-bodied and some people aren't, but they're worthy of respect no matter whether they can walk or not. And we have to teach our children that. And if we teach our children that they are related, that everybody that child sees has an ancestral connection to the person they're looking at, to every child that other child sees, that could be the beginning of a change. Versus thinking that there's that group of people and that group of people. We're all related. And I see that in my family. We're the United Nations when we get together.
Thank you.
One other thing. This is not about hate. This is not about anger. This is about healing. Healing ourselves and healing our country. Taking out the bad information and putting something else in place of that says we care about one another. I grew up in Okinawa, right? Couldn't speak the language, but I made great friends. You can do that. There's something, we have the power to develop relationships with each other. We can bridge the divide. And I would encourage people, if you love this country, you want to do something, check us out. If you realize that people need this, help us by donating money so we can do it. It's not free. None of us are being paid. I want you to understand it. None of us are being paid. Everything's going in to run the program. Yeah.
Paul, thank you. And thank you to everyone from your organization that came tonight. Richard, Randy, Erika, Sam, we so appreciate you and just appreciate the way that you're framing this as love and healing. I think of Frere's words around love, that this work is all about love. As you said, love for our country, love for one another, and a dream that we can do better and be better. So thank you all so very much. At this point, we'll conclude the webinar. Thank you all so much for joining us. It's been a joy to be with you and to be reminded that we're in community and doing this work together. So thank you for being part of our community tonight.
And thank you for the opportunity for all of us. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Hey.
Hi, Paul.
Hi, Z.
Look at you.
Big hug. Yeah.